Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for our select audience who've come along to listen today to this session devoted to Borley Rectory. Borley Rectory, as Steve has indicated, is, in all respects, the most famous haunted house story in the world. It has occupied generations of researchers, and it was entered even when the Guinness Book of Records, now Guinness World Records, listed such things as the most haunted spot in the world. The site of unrivaled paranormal activity from its construction in 1863 to its rather spectacular horror film destruction in February 1939 by fire. One could say it is the ghost case which puts all others to shame. 5 successive rectors and their families over 76 years reported unparalleled numbers of paranormal ghostly phenomena. It's a case which has generated an enormous primary and secondary literature, and perhaps apart from the eternal mystery of the identity of Jack the Ripper, it is probably the biggest and longest running mystery to be solved dating from the 19th century, something which scholars are still arguing about today. Over the years, numerous people have claimed ghostly experiences of one form or another. Many of them were connected with the Ghost Club, others are local residents, and many more are drawn from the long stream of curious, interested visitors which the site has attracted and continues to bring today. Borley Rectory, rather ugly looking red brick Victorian house, was built on the borders of Sussex and Essex, just over the Essex border, in 1863 by the Reverend Henry Bull. The Bulls were a big landowning family who monopolised not only control of the local lands, but were also powerful in the church. They were known as squiresons, incumbents who occupied both the role of squire, lord of the manor, and head of the church. Church was just across the road, Borley Church. The dedication to Borley Church is unknown. Which saint was given its dedication, if it ever has one, is a mystery. It has always been known from all historical records simply as Borley Church. Well, the rectory itself is no longer there, and nothing remains upon the site, but it was an enormous building. It had to be. The Reverend Henry Bull, in his lifetime, managed to father a family of 14 children. And there are even rumours that he may have fathered 1 or 2 others with a lady other than his wife, including on a servant girl who died in mysterious circumstances in 1880. That aside, he was a powerful man, well respected as he had to be as a landowner and priest of the district, who nonetheless became convinced, as the story goes, that Borley Rectory and its grounds were haunted. And it's from his period of incumbency that the first ghosts are reported. Principally, the ghosts at Borley Rectory and the associated ground can be listed as follows. There is a ghostly nun who appears very lifelike. In fact, a number of witnesses described her rather sad or miserable expression. There was an account of a headless man, and one that, of course, all ghost hunters would love to see, a phantom coach and horses driven by a headless coachman. That was supposed to be across the lawn and the road outside. Then there was actually a member of the Bull family in later years, the Reverend Henry Bull's son, Harry Bull, who, after his death in 1927, was alleged to come back to the rectory, seen wearing his favourite plum-coloured red dressing gown, And then we move into the animal world. There were ghostly cats reported at Borley. Along with the apparitions, there were numerous accounts over the years of strange noises, of phantom footsteps, of voices, and most dramatic of all, at various periods, outbreaks of poltergeist activity. Now, you don't see poltergeists, you experience them typically as loud raps, noises, and the physical displacement of objects. Whereas you can say ultimately that maybe ghost sightings are down to subjective hallucinations, that explanation is much more difficult in the case of poltergeist activity, because we are talking about physical disruption, physical activity, things which are occurring in the world around us. The disturbance of objects, furnitures, things like outbreaks of fire. These things cannot be ascribed simply to hallucination because they leave physical traces which are measurable. They are occurring in the world around us. There is no shortage of evidence for poltergeist activity. Borley had more than its fair share of poltergeist activity over the years alleged as occurring to it. The popular model of the 20th century onwards is that poltergeists are inevitably something associated with adolescents and teenagers. That was originally the idea. The idea in the late 19th century, they were the products of naughty little girls playing tricks. That idea is still with us, but what makes poltergeist credible is that the fact the tricks are the same the world over. If we take a legal approach to the evidence for poltergeist activity, we find that poltergeists are proven in the same way that we would prove, say for example, crimes of serial killers or repeat sexual offenders. There is a similarity in patterns. Now this pattern shows up to an extent in the history of Borley Rectory, but it seems to be not a case of a person-centred poltergeist. Probably about 75% seem to be focused upon individuals, not just teenagers or adolescents, but also quite often older women. But there's also a good 25% which seem to be place-centred. And there were reports of successive poltergeist activity, which it is hard to pin down to one particular individual. There were certainly periods where Borley produced poltergeist activity which was quite intense, but the history, as well as the ghosts and apparitions, the poltergeist activity is spread also through the history of the rectory. As I said, the first occupiers were the builder of the rectory with the Bull family. The story spread very quickly amongst the Bull family and locally that they were troubled during their dinner times by the appearance of a ghostly nun at the window, and to avoid being stared at as they were eating and drinking, the Reverend Henry Bull had the window bricked up. And Henry Bull lived there as the squire parson until his death at the rectory in 1892. He was then succeeded by his son Harry. Now Harry claimed numerous experiences of seeing the nun and other spectres in the grounds of the rectory. He would apparently sit in the summer house and could, as the saying went, hail a spirit as readily as a human being. Skeptics have said that he was, pointed to the fact he apparently suffered from narcolepsy. He had a tendency to fall off into sleep and trances, and one could interpret this in two ways. One could say, for example, that Harry Bull was simply dreaming. He was asleep and fancifully having hallucinations or dreams in which he saw these apparitions. Alternatively, one could say it is actually consistent with what we know about ghosts at many other locations, many ghost reports. There is a fascinating time of day pattern which emerges when one looks at hundreds of ghost reports. One sees a kind of time of day phenomena. It's this: basically, nobody seems to see a ghost at breakfast time. None of the stories ever begin, "I was eating my cornflakes when I saw." But as you pass through the day, you find the frequency of sightings of apparitions increases, with a peak between midnight and about 4 a.m, which fits in very much with traditional folklore, the idea that ghost apparitions appear between midnight and cockcrow. A good third of ghost witnesses from cases collected from the 19th century includes my own experience of seeing an apparition in 2011, occurred when the witness was in bed. Now, it seems to suggest there's some link with brain chemistry, with the sleeping brain or the waking up brain or going to sleep state in which the brain is in. But we're talking about a kind of hallucination that can be seen by more than one person and can be seen by animals and also successively on different occasions. What the precise tie-up is, we don't know, but it was equally possible to interpret Harry Bull's encounters with spectres, particularly a headless man he said he saw in the garden, as possibly the display of some psychic, paranormal, mediumistic ability. To an extent where one pays one's money and takes one's choice, but again, his experiences are consistent with many people's experience in many lands over many years. Harry Bull was not the only one who saw ghosts at the Rectory during this period. The most notable sighting occurred on the 28th of July 1900, when the four of the Bull sisters were present in the garden in late afternoon and saw the apparition of a nun gliding through the garden. They described the figure as dark, shadowy. They could make out something of a face, and they believed that the nun was telling her beads as she glided through the garden. They went towards the figure vanished away. It was a collective sighting, a story that they stuck to for the rest of their lives. They were interviewed in 1955 in an early edition of the BBC investigative journal, journalist for the programme Panorama, which is still running, did actually do an interview with one of the Bull sisters about this. They lived nearby throughout their lives, and they confirmed that sighting. Sadly, I fear this unique film record is now lost, but they never wavered in the story of seeing the nun. It was averred locally that the ghostly nun was the victim of a tragic love pact in the Middle Ages, where the nun had eloped with a monk in a carriage, broken her vows. However, they had been captured. The story went that the nun was walled up alive and the monk was hanged, as was the driver of the coach, and that's why they came back as ghosts. That was the folklore. There is no direct evidence that there ever was a nunnery on that spot, save for some investigations that were done at the site in 1954, which showed that there was an earlier building on the site of some description in the pre-18th century. What that was, however, is unlikely to have been a full-blown nunnery. Our records actually from the Middle Ages are quite good of religious institutions. But it was a colourful story which provided at least an explanation for the local people as to why they should be troubled by a ghost. Well, Harry Bull continued living at the Rectory until his death there as well, in a room called the Blue Room in 1927. The Rectory was then empty for a period, and a new couple moved in. It was a clergyman, an Anglo-Indian clergyman named Guy Eric Smith, and his wife Mabel. And very soon after moving into this building, which at the time had no running water on the mains, water came from a well and had no electricity, they were somewhat uncomfortable. They did actually have servants. Clergy salaries did run to employing maids at the time, but it was a fairly uncomfortable location, difficult, big rambling house originally for 14 children, difficult to heat in the winter time, but far more worrying to the Smiths were the ghostly manifestations. And it is here, at this point in 1929, that Borley comes to national attention. They complained of apparitions, they complained of strange noises, they were convinced at the time, it would seem, that the house was haunted by something, and they took the step of contacting the Daily Mirror. This is quite interesting for those of you who know your history of ghosts in the 20th century. The Daily Mirror, this was the first national coverage of Borley, but it was also famous many years later as the newspaper in Britain which broke the story in 1977 of the famous Enfield poltergeist. So never let it be said that the Mirror or the Daily Mirror has never done anything useful. It has contributed marvellously to ghosts and the whole business of hauntings in Britain. Well, they contacted the Mirror, who sent down a reporter, Mr. V.C. Wall. Soon somebody telephoned on a Sunday lunchtime, the leading psychic investigator known to the press in the day. This was a man called Harry Price, who wasted no time in going down to Borley himself and very soon believed he'd witnessed stone throwing, an appearance of an apparition, the movement of a bar of soap, and a séance was conducted with the Smith family, and they came to believe that possibly Harry Bull was trying to contact them. But Price came away convinced that there was something going on, and it began what turned out to be a 20-year involvement with Borley and its story. Well, Price will be discussed later this afternoon. Harry Price was somebody who put psychic research on the map in the 1930s. He was controversial at the time because he had a gift for publicity, in fact, a desire for publicity. He made psychic research, the scientific investigation of the paranormal, newsworthy. He became world famous for some of his investigations. There was a wide range of them. He covered everything from firewalking, claims of levitation. He exposed phony mediums. He was involved with a very strange case of Jeff the Talking Mongoose on the Isle of Man in 1936, which the jury is still out as to what was going on there precisely. It may be perhaps best described as a very bizarre poltergeist case. He became notorious as well for a publicity stunt on Walpurgis Night, April the 30th, 1932, when he went to Germany and in a flair for publicity, he conducted a magical experiment to try and test the tradition that if you took a goat up the Brocken Mountain on Walpurgis Night, it would turn into a young boy. And they duly took the goat up the mountain, and they were followed by some 800 reporters from newspapers across Europe and North America. It ensured worldwide publicity. It didn't do much for his credibility, but it put his name on the map. And he was able to stand up at the end and say that now they've tested magic and that supernatural must be left behind. It must now be the matter of science. He insisted throughout he was a scientific researcher. Much can and will be said about Harry Price and his legacy and how people have interpreted him. But going back to his adventures at Borley, he wanted to continue his investigation with the new incumbents at the Rectory. Now, this was the Reverend Lionel Foyster and his mysterious wife, Marianne. She was some 20 years younger than her husband. And Marianne Foyster is such an unusual character. She has become a subject of books and studies in her own right. She and her husband occupied the rectory for a period of 5 years, 1930 through to 1935. And it is during this period, for 18 months between 1930 and 1931, that some of the most controversial phenomena are claimed to have occurred at the rectory. Harry Price called on them with a lady called Kathleen Goldney, who was an active psychic researcher. Her day job was actually working with her husband as a midwife. They ran together the first artificial insemination clinic set up in London. And it seems that very soon Mrs. Goldney, on questioning Marianne Foyster, asked her about questions to do with her sex life, and rather presumptuously, boldly asked her if she'd ever had an abortion. Well, this did not go down well with the Reverend Foyster and his wife, and effectively it led to Price being banned from the rectory for the next 5 years. For the rest of the period of the Foyster incumbency, he was not welcome. But nonetheless, phenomena were again reported. This is again a controversial period in the history of the rectory. It's where the major poltergeist phenomena are reported as occurring. These included noises, raps, object movements. Mrs. Foyster claimed that she had been assaulted by the ghost and given a black eye. On another occasion, she had been menaced by a dark, shadowy form with claws. And most remarkable of all were a series of wall writings, messages scribbled on the wall addressed to Marianne in very rough scribbled handwriting, calls for light, mass and prayers. And Marianne Foyster maintained that there was something communicating with her. There was also the mysterious appearance of Roman Catholic medallions in the property as well. And the Reverend Foyster began a diary of being in a haunted house, living there. His health was deteriorating. The Foysters were unable to have any children of their own, and they seem to have had a series of adopted children living in the house who also complained of phenomena, as did certain visitors to the rectory. A friend of the Foysters, a man called Dom Richard Whitehouse, who later became a monk in 1931, maintained he had seen whole bottles materialise from the air and smash around Mrs. Foyster. There's also some evidence from local people, inquiries made in the 1990s from people who still remembered Mrs. Foyster, that the local doctor at the time witnessed poltergeist phenomena when visiting the Foysters at the rectory. There were all kinds of stories gathered from a lady called Claudine Matthias, who was the husband of a later clergyman. And opinions split as to whether Mrs. Foyster was simply an hysteric, faking the phenomena, or there was genuine phenomena going on around her. And this has been one of the big, long-running Borley disputes or debates as to the character of Mrs. Foyster. And she turns out to have been a very interesting character. Turns out she was married at least 4 times, at least twice bigamously during her life, and she's become a subject of speculation in her own right. She is a fascinating character, and a number of observers, journalists who went there during the period, seem to have concluded that something was not quite right with Mrs. Foyster, and she seems to have had a troubled life throughout her entire life, but particularly in this period. and it's simply for the period of poltergeist activity, which I said, which occurs over 18 months, that she became famous, and for the rest of her life, she never actually shook off this reputation. At the same time, although she has been much maligned, it seems that she seems to have suffered from a great deal of what's probably best described as Catholic guilt. She seemed to be quite, despite being married to an Anglican clergyman, she seems to have been quite heavily into Roman Catholicism. And at least one of her bigamous marriages was conducted in a Roman Catholic church later on. She's a fascinating subject in her own right. Her life has been used to discredit all the reports of phenomena at this time, and it's even been suggested that the ghosts and poltergeist reports were contrived with her husband, who was hoping to write a best-selling book on the haunting before Harry Price. And it also explains, depending on one's conspiracy theories, why they would not cooperate with Harry Price. Well, after a visit from the Marks Tay spiritualist circle, all phenomena at the rectory ceased in 1931 in terms of major movement of objects, the wall writings and so on. Odd things happened thereafter, but certainly after the spiritualists who came and seemed to quell the ghost, it seems to have calmed down. Well, the Foysters stayed until 1935. The deteriorating health of the Reverend Foyster meant he suffered from severe arthritis, and his last sermon, he collapsed in the pulpit of Borley Church, had led him to be very much an invalid for the rest of his life, and the Foysters moved to East Suffolk. Thereafter, Harry Price returned to the rectory and saw his opportunity. It was an opportunity to rent the property. The Church of England had found no clergyman now wanted to take it, partly because of its lack of facilities, but also because of its reputation of ghosts and hauntings. Harry Price then rented the rectory for a year, and through an advertisement in the Times, he recruited a number of lay observers whose job was to take on in shifts the job of going to the rectory and waiting for ghosts. And here we can actually see in many ways the model of ghost hunting, which has become so familiar with groups, televised appearances and so forth today. It was Harry Price who very much pioneered these kind of techniques. He maintained it was going to be a scientific explanation. He was going to try and get observers trained up using a special book of instructions to record phenomena. A whole guide, Blue Book of Instructions, was published, which included such advice as, if you see the nun, if you can, attempt to speak to her. And it was all kinds of interesting things. The idea was also to record as much activity. Now, again, observers went to the site, and some of them did report phenomena, including a return of the wall writings, or at least marks and scratches with pencil appearing on the walls. Having come from East Anglia myself, having first taken an interest in Borley in the 70s when I was a kid, I first visited the site in 1976. The story of the investigation and the hauntings was still a talking point. It remained in local memory. My late grandfather was a physiotherapist at the West Suffolk Hospital, and amongst his patients he had a gentleman called Mr. Arben, who had been a caretaker at the rectory during the Price occupation of it. And he told conflicting stories. On one hand, he said Harry Price was just a fake, was one claim, and then he equally said, well, he was also a very strange man. Mr. Arben and others claimed of strange experiences. Everyone who seems to have lived in the village at the time was either for or against the haunting. Obviously, those who experienced things, had their experiences and came forward, became part of the Borley story at this stage. Particularly interesting are a couple called the Coopers, who lived in the coach house, or almost a kind of property. It's also known as the Rectory cottage, very close to the Rectory itself. They talked about seeing, witnessing and hearing apparitions, phantoms in the property over a number of years. It got a lot of attention. Price conducted his experiments, at the same time also circulating as late as 2008 were stories that some of the phenomena in this period had actually been manufactured by prankster medical students from Cambridge, cycling over from Cambridge at night and playing tricks on Price's observers. Whatever the case, there's a large amount of observations from Borley Rectory at this time. One of the interesting things about Borley is that the phenomena seem to be seasonal, the reported phenomena. They are concentrated in the summer, not during the winter time. During the winter months, the Rectory seemed to be quiet, flat. It was in the summer that the ghosts appeared. Well, after Price left the scene in 1937, it was briefly, though he never really lived in the building, occupied by a fifth rector, the Reverend Alfred Henning. But because of the inconvenience of the site, the Reverend Henning and his wife decided to move into the rectory at the adjacent parish of Liston. Thereafter, the church decided that they had had enough of Borley Rectory. It was time to get rid of it, so it was sold, and it was sold to a character called Captain Gregson. Captain Gregson took over the building in 1938 and lived there. During his period of occupation, he also claimed to have experienced a number of strange phenomena. He claimed that one of his pets dogs was so terrified it ran away and he never saw the poor animal again. There were footsteps, all kinds of strange things, but also they did suffer at various stages from curiosity seekers. Price records by this stage locally, bus trips were being run from neighbouring towns of curious people who wanted to come and view the rectory, and some of them would actually play pranks, and he actually condemns in some of his writings some of the teenagers. Well, it was during the Gregson occupation that the rectory burnt down. Now, some of the research in Borley was by way of seances. It was conducted by a man called Sidney Glanville and his daughter, who conducted seances and visited the property. They received 11 months before the fire a prediction by means of a planchette that the rectory was going to be burnt down by a ghost which called itself Sunix Amures and its compatriots. Now, the best guess is that Sunix Amures is some kind of Latin pun, and it's actually the word senex from Latin and amores, which is linked up with Latin for bulls, and it was actually a way of saying old man bull. Well, that's one possible interpretation. But strangely enough, 11 months later, after in February 1939, the rectory did burn down. A fire started in the library, a lamp, paraffin lantern was overturned, and the rectory burned down. Studies suggest that maybe the fire was actually started by Captain Gregson as an insurance job. And indeed, there was a court case which was eventually settled out of court with a claim of £750, whereas Gregson had claimed £5,000 on the insurance. Everything points to it, that probably being the case, that Captain Gregson burnt down his own rectory for the money, if we look at the evidence so far as it can be gathered. However, during the fire, as might be imagined, various people claimed they saw ghostly figures amid the flames. And merely because the rectory was then a ruin, it didn't stop reports of ghosts in the ruin. There were claims of a phantom cat, of strange lights, and phenomena occurring through until its final demolition. But there was an interesting twist in 1943. A clergyman based up in Carlisle, the Reverend Canon Pythian Adams, came up with a theory that the nun had been brought over from the continent, and that the various communications and phenomena all indicated that the nun was actually buried on the site of Borley Rectory. 1943, Harry Price arranged for the digging up of the cellar, and lo and behold, they did discover some human remains, a jawbone of what was considered with the forensic science of the time to be a young woman. Interestingly, it was considered medical and dental opinion that this lady in life had suffered from a severe abscess in the jaw, and which would have been very painful, and many of the accounts of the nun describe her as sad or unhappy looking. So it's an interesting feature. The bones, such as they were of the nun, were later laid to rest in Liston churchyard. Well, the rectory ruins were finally demolished in 1945. By this stage, Harry Price had published not just one, but two books. His first had been in 1940, called The Most Haunted House in England. It was the best-selling book of its type in the psychic world through 1941. Apparently it was one of the most borrowed library books during the London Blitz. Following up his success with The Most Haunted House in England, he published a second book, The End of Borley Rectory, which took on the story of the discovery of the bones of the nun, included many other reports of people who had come to the site and claimed they had seen one thing or another. Thereafter, after the remains of the rectory were flattened, the haunting was believed locally to have shifted to the church, and the Reverend A.C. Henning, the vicar of Borley, in 1948 actually wrote a very rare, what is now a very rare book called Haunted Borley, in which he records a number of his experiences. Previous member, now sadly deceased, of the Ghost Club, a journalist called Philip Paul, who worked in East Anglia in the 1940s and 50s, made a number of trips to Borley. He held 7 vigils on the 28th of July from 1948 through till 55. He waited for the ghost. In 1954 he dug up the rectory site with the help of an excavator and found traces of an earlier building, possibly medieval, underneath the rectory. The phenomena, however, largely seem to reduce from about 1960, but successive visitors to the rectory have claimed sightings of the nun, object movements, all kinds of phenomena being reported as well in the church. In the church itself, the Reverend Henning heard on several occasions organ music he couldn't explain, and a gentleman called James Turner, who lived on the site of Borley Rectory, growing mushrooms for a number of years, described a number of phenomena, including the smell of incense, the sighting of the ghostly cat, and strange incidents of a minor poltergeist nature. During this period, and it's part of the Borley controversy, the 3 members of the Society for Psychical Research, including Mrs. Goldney, who'd visited the rectory and caused such offence in 1929, brought out a book called The Haunting of Borley Rectory, which was very much a sceptical hatchet job and a posthumous attack on Harry Price and his methods. This was published with a man called Dr. Eric Dingwall, and the major driving force in it was another man called Trevor Hall. And between them, they launched a quite serious character assassination of Price as a psychical researcher. And this has coloured perceptions of the story ever since. It's not the end of the story, however, by a long chalk. Many people have since questioned their work. The point, indeed, could be made that even if one removes the involvement of Harry Price from the Borley story, there remains an enormous amount of witness testimony, claims of something strange occurring over many years in the area itself. There have been subsequent books. The Society for Psychical Research published a rejoinder to The Haunting, written by a man called Robert Hastings in 1969, and the literature and controversies have continued ever since. And, well, that's really just to give you an introduction. There is more than enough that we could go on with here, and indeed, for the rest of this afternoon, you're going to be treated with some of the finer details of this haunting. But I hope this is encapsulated for you, a summary of the hauntings and alleged hauntings of Borley. It's a fascinating case, and no matter how long it is talked about, well, it's almost become a legend. It is one ghost story which indeed will never end. But thank you very much for listening to me this afternoon. If there are any questions, I'll take any questions, but there's certainly a lot more to hear. Can I say thank you very much for listening this afternoon.